It was a bright and sunny afternoon when the billionaire decided to leave his office earlier than usual. He had been buried in work for weeks, attending endless meetings, signing piles of documents, and making decisions that could change the lives of thousands of people. His usual routine was rigid and predictable. He would work late into the evening and return home only when the streets were quiet, but today felt different. Something inside him told him to break the pattern, to step out of his usual schedule, and just come home early. As he drove through the busy streets in his sleek, black luxury car, he thought about the quiet comfort of his mansion, the way the afternoon sunlight usually filtered through the tall windows of his living room, and the soft hum of the air conditioning that made his home feel like a small, perfect world. He was looking forward to a moment of peace, maybe to read a book or just enjoy a cup of coffee in silence. Away from the chaos of his high-powered life, the idea of being home earlier than expected gave him a strange sense of excitement, almost like a secret. When he pulled into the driveway of his mansion, everything seemed unusually calm. The gates, usually attended by a security guard who would greet him politely, were open and empty. There was no sign of the usual activity, no sound of the staff moving around, and the garden looked untouched, almost as if time itself had slowed down. He paused for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of relief and curiosity, wondering why the house seemed so still. As he stepped out of the car, the soft crunch of gravel under his shoes echoed unusually loudly in the silent driveway. He adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed his suit, and walked toward the front door, expecting to see at least a servant hurrying past, carrying some task or another, but the hallway inside was quiet, and the usual hum of life that filled his home was missing. Even the large chandelier above the entrance did not sparkle as brightly as it usually did, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He called out softly, "Is anyone here?" But only the echo of his own voice answered him. The quiet was unusual, even for a house that was supposed to be orderly and disciplined. He felt a tiny shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar emptiness. He had never arrived home this early before, and the absence of his staff created a strange suspense, like walking into a place where something unexpected was about to happen. Moving further into the house, he noticed little details that seemed out of place: a chair slightly out of position, a vase on the table that was no longer perfectly aligned. The kind of small signs that usually went unnoticed in the routine of his busy life suddenly stood out, drawing his attention. It was almost as if the house itself was whispering that something unusual was about to unfold. He could feel his heartbeat quicken slightly, not in fear, but in anticipation, curiosity taking over his usual composure. He reached the kitchen area, which was usually bustling with activity at any time of the day. He expected to hear the clatter of dishes or the sound of someone preparing food, but instead, the room was silent. The air smelled faintly of cooked meals, but the source of the smell was unclear. It gave him a strange sense of unease, mixed with curiosity. He could sense that something was happening that he had never expected, and his mind started racing with possibilities. He paused at the doorway, taking a slow breath, and allowed himself to notice the smaller details: the faint smell of spices, the open refrigerator door, the half-empty containers on the counter, and then a movement from the corner of his eye, something that made his heart skip a beat. He realized that he was not alone in the kitchen, but the person that was doing something completely unexpected, something that would soon change the calm afternoon into a moment he would never forget. In that instant, he felt a mixture of shock, confusion, and curiosity. He had never anticipated returning home to witness a scene so ordinary yet so completely against the rules of his household. The quiet afternoon had turned into the calm before the storm, and he knew, even before stepping fully into the kitchen, that this early return would be anything but ordinary. Something extraordinary, or perhaps scandalous, was about to unfold, and he could feel the tension building in the air. As he stepped further into the kitchen, the billionaire froze for a moment, the silence around him heavier than anything he had ever experienced. The usual symphony of clattering dishes, sizzling pans, and quiet conversations that filled the house was completely absent. It was almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. His eyes scanned the room carefully, noting the details he had never paid attention to before: the polished marble countertops reflected the sunlight streaming through the large windows, yet the glow seemed strangely muted, as if the house itself was uneasy. He noticed the faint smell of food lingering in the air, not unpleasant, but different, slightly chaotic. His mind tried to place it, and he realized it was the aroma of yesterday's leftovers mixed with something stronger, something hurriedly cooked and half forgotten. He took a careful step forward, the sound of his shoes on the polished floor unusually loud in the quiet room. Every instinct told him that something was off. But curiosity pushed him forward, each step tightening the suspense in the air. He moved closer to the pantry area, where he had seen movement out of the corner of his eye earlier. His hand hovered over the counter as he approached, a mix of caution and anticipation coursing through him. The silence around him seemed almost unnatural, as if it were waiting to be broken by a single, shocking moment. He wondered for a second if he should call out, to announce his presence, but the thought of what he might see made him hesitate. The kitchen was immaculate in its design, yet today it felt strangely alien. The knives were perfectly arranged on the magnetic strip, the fruit bowl untouched, and the sparkling sink empty of dishes, but the subtle disorder, the fridge slightly ajar, a spoon left on the counter, made him uneasy. These little imperfections, which normally would have gone unnoticed, now seemed like clues to something unexpected. His mind raced, trying to anticipate what could have caused such strange behavior in his usually disciplined household. Then he noticed it, a faint rustling sound from behind the island counter, almost like someone trying to hide. His heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from the sharp surge of curiosity and surprise. He knew immediately that this sound was not from any guest or family member. It was deliberate, almost secretive, and it made him pause, forcing him to slow his steps and adjust his posture. As he leaned slightly forward, the anticipation grew, every small noise amplified in the stillness of the house. He realized that the strange silence wasn't emptiness at all. It was a careful, intentional quiet, like someone was trying to avoid being noticed. His mind flashed through possibilities. Was it a surprise, a prank, or something more serious? The uncertainty made him tense, yet he felt a strange thrill, like stepping into an unknown story, something entirely outside his control. The air seemed heavier now, filled with unspoken tension, and he knew he was moments away from discovering the truth. He inched closer, his eyes finally settling on a small, familiar figure in the corner of the kitchen, and then he saw it fully, a scene that made him pause and blink in disbelief. Everything about the room, the quiet, the subtle disorder, the smells, and the rustling, led to this single, shocking moment. It was the reason the house had felt so silent, the reason every detail seemed heightened. The anticipation exploded in his mind as he tried to process what he was seeing without making a sound. The silence around him, once strange and eerie, had become almost a stage, holding the scene together, highlighting every movement, every small detail. His heart raced as he realized that this quiet was not emptiness, but a deliberate pause before the revelation. The house itself seemed to hold its breath with him, the walls, the floors, and even the sunlight standing witness to what was about to unfold. In that moment, he understood that nothing in his controlled, orderly life could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. As he finally stepped fully into the kitchen, the billionaire's eyes widened in disbelief. The figure he had glimpsed moments ago was none other than his maid, usually composed and perfectly professional, yet today she was crouched in front of the refrigerator, hurriedly devouring leftovers. Her movements were frantic, almost desperate, and the sight hit him like a wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had expected messes, perhaps a small mistake, but this scene was entirely unexpected. Completely out of the ordinary. The smell of food was stronger now, a mixture of warm, slightly spoiled leftovers and hastily reheated meals. The sound of her chewing and the rustling of containers echoed loudly in the still kitchen, filling the space with an awkward intensity. He felt a rush of shock and confusion, unable to comprehend how someone he trusted completely could act so brazenly under his roof. His mind raced, questioning whether he should step in immediately or just observe for a moment. He noticed small details that made the scene even more surprising. The maid's uniform was slightly disheveled, a button undone, her apron crumpled as if she had been moving too fast to care about appearances. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed at the food, and her eyes, when she finally glanced up, were wide with panic and guilt. The combination of fear and haste painted a picture he had never imagined in his perfectly controlled home. For a brief moment, he simply watched, frozen in place, trying to process what he was seeing. The house, usually so orderly, seemed almost to hold its breath with him, waiting for the moment to explode into chaos or explanation. He felt a swirl of emotions, anger, disbelief, curiosity, and a strange, unexpected empathy. He had always prided himself on control, on knowing everything happening in his home. Yet in this one instant, he realized how little he truly knew. She suddenly noticed him standing there, and her hands froze mid-motion. The crumbs on the counter and the containers in her lap were evidence of her hurried actions. Her face turned pale, and her eyes darted nervously, trying to find a reason to explain herself, to justify what she knew was completely unacceptable in his eyes. For a moment, words failed both of them, the silence heavy and tense, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, as she slowly set down the food and stood up, he could see the shame and fear etched into her expression. Her normally confident posture had collapsed into one of vulnerability, and he felt a flicker of something unexpected stir inside him, a combination of surprise and curiosity about her story. Why would she act like this in a house where she had always followed the rules perfectly? What had driven her to this point? He took a step closer, his eyes studying her carefully, noticing the small details that revealed more than words could: tired eyes, calloused hands, a hint of worry lines on her face. He realized that this wasn't just a simple act of carelessness, but perhaps the reflection of a struggle he had never considered. His initial shock began to mix with a strange sense of understanding, and he forced himself to take a slow breath, trying to calm the sudden rush of thoughts. The kitchen, once a place of order and routine, had transformed into a stage for a deeply human moment, raw and unfiltered. The billionaire knew that what he was witnessing was not just about food or rules, but about life, desperation, and the hidden stories of those around him. In that instant, he understood that this shocking discovery was more than a mistake. It was an unexpected glimpse into a world he had been blind to, a world where appearances could never tell the full story. And so he stood there, heart racing, mind alert, as the maid, trembling slightly, awaited his reaction. The silence between them was thick with tension, yet charged with anticipation. The shocking discovery had set the stage for a moment that would test both their understanding, trust, and humanity. The billionaire realized that from this point onward, nothing in his home, or his perception of the people in it, would ever be the same. The billionaire stood frozen for a moment, his mind spinning as he tried to process the scene before him. The maid, usually composed and polite, was now caught in a moment of raw vulnerability, eating leftovers with a mixture of desperation and fear. The shock that surged through him was almost physical, a tightening in his chest, as if the calm of his controlled world had suddenly been shattered. He had always believed that he knew everything that happened under his roof, yet this unexpected sight made him realize how little he truly understood about the lives of those around him. At first, his instinct was to react with anger, a sharp reprimand that would remind her of the rules and the boundaries she had crossed. He could feel the surge of frustration rise, fueled by years of strict order and expectation, but at the same time, something else stirred within him, a strange curiosity mixed with a flicker of empathy. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, the way her eyes avoided his gaze, and the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to disappear from the consequences of her actions. He took a slow step forward, his shoes clicking softly on the polished floor, and cleared his throat. The maid froze completely, her fork mid-air, crumbs falling silently onto the countertop. Her eyes widened, and she swallowed nervously, knowing that her small act of indulgence had been exposed. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, every small sound amplified in the silence, every breath a reminder of the fragility of the moment. "Why," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority and surprise, "would you do this?" His words were measured, deliberate, not harsh, but carrying the expectation of an answer. The maid's face flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment, she simply stared at him, unable to find the right words. The reality of being caught, of standing face to face with someone she respected and feared, seemed to paralyze her completely. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and hesitant. I didn't mean to, sir." Each word trembled, revealing more than the explanation itself. He could see her guilt, her shame, and perhaps a deeper worry he had never imagined. In that instant, his anger softened slightly, replaced by a complicated mix of surprise, concern, and the faint stirrings of understanding. He realized that this was not simply about broken rules or carelessness, but about something more human, more real, something he had ignored in his pursuit of perfection and control. He took another step closer, trying to calm his own racing thoughts. "Tell me," he said gently, "what's really going on?" The maid hesitated, then sighed quietly, realizing that there was no point in hiding her actions now. Her voice, trembling but honest, revealed a glimpse into her world, the exhaustion from long hours, the struggle to manage her personal life while meeting the demands of a wealthy household, the small moments of hunger she tried to hide, and the fear of judgment that always followed her. The billionaire listened, every detail cutting through the initial shock. His mind slowly shifted from anger to reflection. He saw the human behind the uniform, the woman behind the role, and the struggles that his wealth and privilege had shielded him from understanding. What he had first perceived as betrayal was now unfolding as a moment of vulnerability, a hidden story of hardship and endurance. He took a deep breath, letting the tension in the room ease slightly, and said nothing immediately, letting the silence speak for him. The maid looked up at him, unsure whether she had earned forgiveness, reprimand, or something in between. The moment stretched on, heavy with emotion, yet also charged with the possibility of connection and understanding. It was a pause in time where shock and revelation collided, forcing both of them to confront the realities of their lives and the gap between appearances and truth. In that instant, he realized that his initial reaction, the one driven by authority and routine, would not define the outcome, that the way he chose to respond now could either deepen the divide or begin to bridge it, and so he stood there, watching, listening, and learning, the room still silent but no longer empty, knowing that this initial reaction, though filled with shock, would be the turning point for both of them. The maid took a trembling breath, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She looked up at the billionaire, her eyes searching his face for any hint of anger, disappointment, or understanding. The kitchen, which moments ago had been a scene of shock and tension, now felt heavy with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her words. She knew that what she was about to say could change everything, for better or worse, and yet she felt that honesty was the only path forward. I didn't mean to upset you, sir, she began softly, her voice shaking. It's just, things have been very difficult lately. She paused, swallowing hard as if the words were catching in her throat. Her uniform, once crisp and neat, now looked slightly worn, her hair slightly messy, and her eyes told a story of fatigue and worry that no one in the household had ever noticed. She continued, her voice gaining a small measure of courage. I've been trying to manage everything at home, the bills, my family. I didn't have time to eat properly today, and I was so hungry, sir. The billionaire listened in silence, his initial shock softening into a quiet curiosity. He had always assumed that everyone in his household lived comfortably, under his protection, with nothing to worry about, yet her words shattered that assumption, revealing a world of struggle and perseverance he had never considered. He noticed the tremor in her hands, the weariness in her posture, and the sincerity in her voice. It was a side of life he had been insulated from, a reality that was both humbling and enlightening. I didn't want to make a mess, or do something wrong, she admitted, glancing nervously at the food containers still on the counter. I needed to eat something before continuing with my work. I didn't think you would come home early, sir. There was a pause, a silence heavy with vulnerability, as she awaited his reaction. Her honesty, raw and unfiltered, filled the space between them with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, he saw her not just as a maid, but as a person with fears, responsibilities, and a life beyond the walls of his mansion. The billionaire's mind raced as he processed her explanation. The anger and surprise that had surged through him only moments ago were giving way to understanding, empathy, and reflection. He realized how little he truly knew about the daily struggles of the people who served him, the sacrifices they made quietly, without complaint. He could see the courage it took for her to speak so openly, to admit her vulnerability in a house where mistakes were rarely overlooked. I had no idea, he said finally, his voice calmer than before. I assumed that everything here was easy, that everyone had what they needed. I never thought someone could feel this desperate in my house. His words were not a scolding, but a confession of his own ignorance, a recognition that he had been blind to the realities outside his world of wealth and comfort. The maid's eyes softened slightly at his tone, realizing that the conversation was moving toward understanding rather than punishment. She nodded slowly, relief and gratitude flickering across her face. I just wanted to do my work well, sir, and sometimes that meant I had to skip meals, or manage with whatever I could find, she said quietly. I never meant to disrespect you or your home. Her words hung in the air, carrying the weight of honesty and unspoken struggle, and the billionaire felt a strange mixture of admiration and responsibility. He had expected rebellion or carelessness, but what he saw instead was determination, resilience, and human vulnerability. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence now filled with a shared understanding. He realized that this explanation was more than a justification. It was a bridge between two worlds, between privilege and struggle, between authority and humanity. The maid had exposed her reality, and in doing so, had opened his eyes to a truth he had never considered. He could no longer see her as just an employee, but as a person navigating challenges he could barely imagine. Finally, he took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly, with sincerity and a new sense of awareness. "I had no idea, and I'm glad you were honest with me." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension easing from her body, as she realized that honesty had not led to punishment, but to understanding. The shocking act of eating leftovers had become a catalyst for empathy, reflection, and a new kind of connection between them. The billionaire stepped back for a moment, leaning against the cool marble countertop. His eyes followed the maid as she carefully cleaned up the few crumbs and containers left from the hurried meal. The silence between them was no longer tense, but reflective, filled with a quiet understanding that had begun to settle in the room. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed, the small act of eating leftovers. Something so ordinary in the lives of most people, had struck him with the force of a revelation. He thought about his own life, about the endless cycle of meetings, contracts, and deadlines, and realized that he had never paused to consider the struggles of those who lived in the shadows of his wealth. He had always believed that his home ran like clockwork, that everything was perfect because he had arranged it so, yet now he saw that perfection was only a surface, a carefully maintained illusion that hid the small battles, sacrifices, and human challenges that happened every day. He remembered the way the maid had looked, her hands shaking slightly, her eyes wide with both fear and honesty. It struck him how much courage it had taken for her to admit something so personal and vulnerable. He realized that his initial shock and anger had been fueled not by the act itself, but by his own assumptions, his expectations of control and order. For the first time, he understood that life was messy, unpredictable, and full of moments that could not be planned or controlled. His thoughts wandered to the other staff, the people who served him silently, who worked long hours without complaint, who often sacrificed their own comfort for the smooth running of his luxurious life. He realized he had never truly seen them as individuals, with families, problems, or dreams beyond the walls of his mansion. This small incident had opened a window into a world he had ignored. A world of quiet struggle and perseverance, and he felt a pang of guilt for his blindness. He thought about the lessons that the maid's actions had inadvertently taught him, the importance of empathy, of pausing to notice the people around you, of understanding that appearances could never tell the full story. He realized that wealth and power had insulated him from human realities, shielding him from the struggles that were ordinary and natural to everyone else. The contrast between his life of abundance and her small, hidden struggle was stark, yet it carried a truth he could not ignore. He also reflected on the way he had reacted, the initial shock and anger that had surged through him, and the shift toward curiosity and understanding. He realized that moments like these, uncomfortable and unexpected, were opportunities for growth, for seeing beyond the surface, and for connecting with the lives of others in a way that authority or control could never achieve. He had learned something deeper about humanity, humility, and the responsibility that came with his position. Looking at the maid again, he saw not a subordinate or employee, but a person with a story, a life, and struggles that deserved recognition and respect. He understood that her actions were not defiance, but survival, and that acknowledging her reality was far more important than enforcing rules or demonstrating authority. The shock of the afternoon had given way to a moment of clarity, a reflection that would stay with him far longer than any business deal or contract ever could. He allowed himself to pause, taking a deep breath, letting the weight of the realization settle in. Life, he thought, was full of small, unnoticed moments that could teach the greatest lessons, if only one was willing to see. The maid's simple act, born out of necessity and honesty, had offered him a perspective he had never considered, a mirror to his own life of privilege and detachment. It reminded him that wealth could never replace understanding, and that true insight came from noticing the humanity in others. For the first time that day, he smiled slightly, not out of amusement, but out of a quiet appreciation for the lesson he had received. He realized that his life, though luxurious, had been incomplete in its blindness, and that this small, shocking incident had opened a door to a deeper awareness. A simple act of eating leftovers had transformed into a moment of reflection and perspective that would change the way he saw the people around him forever. The billionaire stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the afternoon's events sink in. His mind had been racing since the shocking discovery and the maid's heartfelt explanation. He realized that this was more than a small household incident. It was a test of character, compassion, and understanding. He could enforce the rules, punish her for her lapse, or he could take a different path. One that might change both of their lives. He looked at the maid, still standing nervously by the counter, her posture a mixture of shame and hope. She had revealed her vulnerability with honesty, something rare in a household of strict hierarchy, and now the choice was his. The anger that had bubbled up moments ago had faded, replaced by a strange calm, a recognition that his decision could either widen the gap between them or build a bridge. After a long pause, he spoke gently, his voice measured and steady. "I understand why you did it," he said, watching her eyes widen in surprise. "And I don't think you should feel ashamed of being human, of feeling hunger or struggle." The maid blinked, almost as if she could not believe his words. She had expected scolding, perhaps anger or punishment, but instead there was understanding, a rare empathy that made her chest tighten with relief. He continued, "I could have ignored what was happening in your life, continued living in my own world, but I see now that honesty and trust are more important than perfection or rules." He gestured slightly to the containers and crumbs. "And this small mistake doesn't define you, nor does it erase the respect I have for your work and dedication." The maid's shoulders began to relax, a small, grateful smile forming on her face, and the tension in the kitchen started to ease. The billionaire paused again, thinking carefully about the consequences of his choice. He realized that compassion would have a ripple effect, not just for the maid, but for the entire household. If he treated her with understanding, it could foster trust, loyalty, and openness. If he reacted with harshness, it could create fear, resentment, and distance. He made a conscious decision to act not out of authority, but out of empathy, choosing humanity over control. "From now on," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I want you to feel comfortable asking for help if you need it, and to trust that honesty is valued here." The maid's eyes shone with emotion, tears threatening to spill. She had never expected such kindness, especially from someone she had always seen as distant and powerful. It was a moment of connection that went beyond words, beyond wealth or hierarchy. He then took a step back, letting the moment breathe, knowing that actions would speak louder than words. "I will also make sure that no one in this household has to go without what they need," he added, a promise in his tone, "and that everyone here is treated fairly and with dignity." The maid's expression shifted from relief to quiet gratitude, the weight of fear lifting from her shoulders. She realized that this incident, which could have ended in humiliation or punishment, had become a turning point, a moment of recognition and trust. The decision, simple as it seemed, carried consequences that would resonate long after the day ended. The billionaire had chosen to transform a moment of shock into a lesson of empathy. The maid had been given not just understanding, but a chance to feel seen, respected, and human in a world that often ignored such small realities. The atmosphere in the kitchen, once heavy and tense, now carried a quiet warmth, a new sense of connection between the two. He watched her resume her work, no longer rushed or anxious, but calm and assured, knowing that the consequences of his decision were already unfolding, trust replacing fear, honesty replacing secrecy, and respect replacing authority. The simple act of devouring leftovers had sparked a moment of profound change, proving that even small, everyday events could have life-altering impacts when met with understanding. And in that moment, the billionaire realized that his choice to act with compassion would not only shape this incident but also define the kind of person he wanted to be, a man capable of seeing beyond appearances, responding to humanity, and turning shock and mistakes into opportunities for connection and growth. The consequences of his decision would ripple through his household and his life in ways he could only begin to imagine. The afternoon sunlight streamed softly through the tall windows, casting warm golden rays across the kitchen. The air, once heavy with shock and tension, now felt lighter, almost as if the house itself had relaxed. The billionaire stood quietly, watching the maid move around the room with careful, deliberate motions. Her anxiety had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence and relief, and in that small change, he saw the impact of his choice. The simple act of responding with compassion had transformed not only her demeanor but also the atmosphere of the entire household. He leaned against the counter, reflecting on the series of events that had unfolded. The shocking discovery, the explanation, the initial fear, and the moment of decision had all combined to teach him something he could never have learned from business meetings or boardrooms. The lesson was clear: wealth, power, and order could never replace empathy, understanding, and human connection. It was not about rules or appearances, but about noticing the lives of those around him, and valuing their struggles and honesty. He thought about the maid, about the courage it had taken for her to speak openly, and the vulnerability she had shown. He realized that every person, regardless of their role or status, carries their own burdens, hidden worries, and challenges. He had lived most of his life insulated from such realities, protected by privilege and routine, but now, through this small and unexpected incident, he had glimpsed a truth he could not ignore. A quiet smile touched his lips as he understood that life often teaches lessons in the most unexpected ways. He had arrived home expecting nothing unusual, only to witness a moment that would forever change the way he saw his household. The incident with the leftovers, seemingly trivial at first, had become a mirror reflecting both his own assumptions and the hidden realities of those he considered beneath him. It was a lesson in humility, awareness, and the power of simple human honesty. He realized that leadership was not just about authority, instructions, or maintaining appearances, but also about seeing, listening, and responding to the people who support and sustain your life. True power, he understood now, came not from control, but from the ability to empathize, to recognize struggle, and to act with fairness and kindness. The choice he had made in that moment had created trust, respect, and a connection that would last far longer than any punishment or reprimand could. He also reflected on himself, on the distance he had maintained between his life of luxury and the world of ordinary human struggle. He understood that he had been blind to the small hardships, the quiet sacrifices, and the resilience of those around him, and that this blindness had kept him from truly knowing the people he relied upon. The lesson was not just for the maid, but for him as well. A profound realization that true awareness comes from seeing beyond privilege, noticing vulnerability, and valuing honesty. As he watched her complete her work with newfound ease, he felt a sense of peace he had rarely experienced. The household, once a place of rigid order and silent expectation, now felt alive with trust, transparency, and understanding. The incident had shifted the balance of their relationship, not by punishment or control, but through recognition of humanity. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions, like eating leftovers in a moment of weakness, can reveal the deepest truths about life, resilience, and compassion. The billionaire took a deep breath, letting the lessons of the day sink fully into his mind. He understood that this moment, small and unexpected as it seemed, had changed him. It had reminded him to pause, to observe, and to respond with empathy before judgment, to consider the stories behind every action, and to value honesty even when it disrupts the calm of routine. He realized that growth often comes from the unplanned, the surprising, and the human. Finally, he spoke softly. "I will not forget this lesson," he said, almost to himself, "and I will carry it forward in the way I see the people around me." The maid looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and relief. She had not just been forgiven, but seen, understood, and respected. The lesson learned that day was mutual, bridging the gap between privilege and struggle, authority and humanity. And it was a lesson that would echo through their lives for years to come. In that quiet kitchen, bathed in the golden afternoon light, the billionaire realized that life's greatest lessons were often found in the most ordinary moments, and that true understanding, compassion, and empathy could turn shock, mistakes, and fear into growth, trust, and connection.